I had a nickel for every Latin American country where Coke assassinated union leaders in, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. This is the story behind the Coca-Cola death squads. Roll intro. Fiercely opposed, began a boycott. Security just stood there and watched. A bomb in the plant basically tried to kidnap his daughter, cut out his tongue, and shoved it in a lawsuit filed in the United States against Coke prison for 6 months. That's crazy. So there are 2 different countries that we're going to be diving into today. One is going to be Guatemala and one is going to be Colombia. And right off the bat, I'm going to say I'm not going to try to pronounce everybody's names because some of these names I just have no idea how to say them. So if I don't know how to say them, I'm just going to throw them up on the screen right now if I'm referencing a specific person that died. We're going to be tackling these in chronological order. So the first one we're going to talk about is in Guatemala. In the 1970s leading up to 1980, at least 11 people were assassinated in Guatemala due to them trying to unionize against the local Coca-Cola franchise bottling plant that was in Guatemala at the time. The attorney of the union at the time who survived all of this described Coca-Cola's presence in Guatemala as a symbol of oppression, exploitation, and of disrespect for human rights and dignity. She also stated that the lawyer that worked for Coca-Cola at the time first approached the union before the deaths and stated that if the workers want a union, what they will have instead will be blood. But to get into why this local Coca-Cola bottling plant was so against unions, we have to go all the way back to 1956. So back in 1956, an American lawyer, John C. Trotter, bought the Coca-Cola franchise in Guatemala. And while he owned it in Guatemala, he lived in Houston, Texas, and operated the business from there. And it was all the way back in 1956 that he made it clear that he would have fiercely opposed any sort of union organization whatsoever in all of Guatemalan industry, whether he was involved in it or not. And he had this very anti-union stance from the absolute get-go. There's about 450 workers who joined the union, and they tried 3 different times to get the Coca-Cola people to come to the table, recognize their union, and give them better working conditions. When they started doing those 3 stints, that's when the violence starts. The violence really starts to kick off in 1978, so about 22 years later, he's been operating this plant and still strictly opposed to unions. The union general secretary, Israel Marquez, narrowly escapes a machine gun attack at his home where they try to gun him down. Then the next date I could find was only a few weeks later on December 12th, a man who had received a death threat directly from the owner, Trotter, who was the union's financial secretary, Pedro Cuavado, was assassinated on his delivery round, and he was shot 8 times in the chest and 4 times in the face. This is the first murder that has details that I can find. I'm not for sure if this is the first one that happened out of the 11, but this is the first one that I could find dates and a name for. Then on April 5th, less than 5 months later, the next general secretary, again having been warned and receiving death threats, he was beat with an iron tube and had his throat slit, killing him instantly. It's at this point in time where the workers, as well as other locals in Guatemala, begin a boycott of everything Coca-Cola in their entire country that they can. And a few months later, in June of 1979, Amnesty International and the International Union of Food and Allied Workers Association, IUF, stepped up and joined in beside these workers to try to support them as well internationally to put pressure on Coca-Cola. Despite this, many more killings occurred over the summer, including another union leader, Anolfo Gomez, I think is how you say it. He was found with his lip slashed with razor blades, and they had cut out his tongue and shoved it in his shirt pocket, and they smashed his toes and fingernails, and that's how they found him dead. It was after this particularly brutal murder getting out that many unions all throughout the world started putting pressure on Coca-Cola wherever they were from, as well as major universities started protesting Coca-Cola and pulling out of agreements they had with Coca-Cola. Extreme pressure reached all the way up to Coca-Cola's Atlanta headquarters, but their response initially was they had no control over their overseas franchisees due to the agreements of their contracts and everything. They had no ability to do anything about it, that it wasn't actually their company, it was just franchise subsidiary, and they had no control of the operations or whatever you have it. And they literally said their hands were tied on the situation. Pressure continued to mount for several months, and in April 1980, there was a sit-down protest at the plant in Guatemala, which ended up being broken up by police with machine guns and tear gas, and I believe this is when another one of the deaths occur. At this point, the pressure against Coca-Cola was extreme from thousands of unions all over the world. There started to be Coca-Cola boycotts in several countries all over the world. There was so much pressure on Coca-Cola, and actually the controversy around this was so intense that Pepsi was starting to gain market share against Coca-Cola. That's kind of what was getting them to consider maybe coming to the table to do something about this franchise location. But things truly come to a peak on June 21st of 1980. There's a group of men who were dressed in civilian clothes but armed with machine guns. They burst through the gate of the Coca-Cola factory in the middle of the day during operations, and they killed the union officer Edgar Rene Aldama Palesser. Just full daylight, middle of the day. Gun him down. And a few minutes later, the manager of the plant, Lieutenant Francisco Javier Rodas Flores, was shot to death in his car as well. And it's said that they did this right in front of the plant security, and the security just stood there and watched. It's after this in July of 1980 where Coca-Cola finally comes to the table, and they meet with the IUF in Geneva to strike up a deal, because they know that thousands of unions across the entire world are going to strike against Coca-Cola if they do not do something about this situation. And thankfully, Coca-Cola strikes a deal and the violence stops. They force the sale and transfer the franchise away from the anti-union owner to a new owner, put it under entirely new management, and both the new owner and new management recognized the union and protected them, and everyone signed a peace pact agreement saying that there would be no violence and no more threats at this plant. Every fired and threatened worker were offered their job back, as well as they set up a fund to go to the families of all the people who had died at the plant. However, this was so damaging for this plant in Guatemala that it was only 4 years later that this plant would end up closing down and went bankrupt, largely due to all the boycotts, all the violence, and the people just completely losing trust not only in Coca-Cola, but just not wanting to have anything to do with the plant and the brand anymore in that area. And because that plant closed down, it feels like that the people who died got a little bit of extra justice. And for that, I'm gonna crack open a cold Pepsi just to shove it in Coca-Cola's face. It's a protest-see. And while that's kind of the gist of everything that happened in Guatemala, Coke would only have peace from this kind of violence for a mere decade before things would break out in a different country starting in 1990. When workers in Colombia started trying to unionize in 1990, between then and 2002, at least 10 different union leaders were assassinated, mostly by a militant group called the United Self-Defense Force of Colombia, who was working alongside the operators of the Coca-Cola bottling plant in that area. During the 90s and the early 2000s, Colombia was actually the most dangerous place on earth for people in unions, where over 4,000 people were murdered over the course of 15 years who were part of unions. In the year 2000 alone, 128 labor leaders in Colombia were assassinated, and most of these murders would be attributed to that paramilitary group, the United Defense Forces of Colombia. And before we get into the details, I'm going to throw up the names and dates of the people that I could find who passed away during this period. And we're gonna just give them a moment of silence. The deaths in Colombia got a lot of attention because there was actually a lawsuit filed in the United States against Coca-Cola itself, as well as the Colombian subsidiary and the business affiliates who were involved in contacting the paramilitary group. According to the lawsuits, the death squads murdered, tortured, kidnapped, and threatened union leaders at the multinational soft drink manufacturer's Colombian bottling plant. And this suit was filed in July 20th, 2001, which is ironic because there are actually deaths at plants after the fact of union leaders. According to Terry Collingsworth, who was part of the International Labor Rights Fund and co-counsel in the lawsuit, he said, "There's no question that Coke knew about and benefits from the systematic repression of trade union rights at its bottling plants in Colombia, and this case will hopefully make the company accountable." And we can highlight a couple of the deaths that were laid out in the lawsuit. In September 27th of 1996, the union sent a letter to the Colombian headquarters of Coca-Cola Colombia informing them that they had had threats made against their lives and requesting them to intervene to prevent further violence, human rights abuses, cases against the union and the employees. But Coca-Cola Columbia did absolutely nothing, and it was only a few months later on December 5th where the executive board member of the union was killed. It was 2 days later on December 7th where the paramilitary group enters the plant again and takes the union employees hostage, giving them only 3 options: to sign union resignation forms, to leave the city of Corepa, or to be killed. After they gave them this ultimatum, they led the workers one by one into an office where they already had paperwork ready which would declare them to leave the union. And it was at this point that every single union member that hadn't been assassinated signed the forms, and the union was officially busted at the Corepa plant. But this wasn't the only plant that was having issues. At another plant, they did a 120-hour strike to protest the fact that the company eliminated medical insurance. And it was after the strike that the chief security officer for the Bucaramanga plant, I think is what it's called, told authorities that he had found a bomb in the plant, and he accused the 5 members of the local union board for planting the bomb. And these 5 union leaders were imprisoned for 6 months. That's crazy. However, they only were imprisoned for 6 months because an investigation found that there was no evidence of a bomb ever even existing, and that the security officer of the plant was lying. It was after this that the president of the union for that plant was threatened with assassination multiple times, including one point where somebody just came into the plant and put on the wall, "Get out Galvez," which was the president's name. Despite another assassination happening while this lawsuit was going on, Coca-Cola corporate ends up getting dismissed from this lawsuit and doesn't have to be held accountable at all. They were removed because they allegedly wrongdoing either occurred in the United States but was too removed from the injury that occurred abroad. They basically got away with it because this didn't happen in America, and the judges dismissed it for not happening in America. The case did continue to go on against the other 2 bottlers for a couple more years, but even then, at that point, it was dismissed in 2006 and nothing came of this lawsuit. And while that was appealed, that was dismissed once again in 2009. This lawsuit was brought under the Alien Tort Claims Act, which was at this point a centuries-old law which allowed foreigners to sue U.S. companies for damages caused abroad. But even with this act, they still weren't able to get justice. And it was while all this was going on that Coca-Cola earned $1.1 billion in the year 2001. But even after this lawsuit's dismissal, horrible things just continued to happen in Colombia. Coca-Cola retaliatorily closed down one of its plants in Colombia, and the union organized a hunger strike. It was after this the union leaders were receiving constant death threats every single day pretty much. It was so bad that the local union president had to have 2 bodyguards every single day, always carried a gun of his own. 3 of his relatives were assassinated in their homes in 2005. Another union official, William Mendoza, had the paramilitary group try to kidnap his daughter to use against him, who was only 4 years old. He believes he was targeted because in 2003 he released documents which helped prove financial collusion between the plant managers and paramilitary forces. Part of the reason why Coca-Cola itself has been able to get away without having to have too much accountability for what goes on is because these plants were owned by FEMSA, which is a Mexico-based owner of the plants in Colombia. And well, Coca-Cola corporate owns 40% of FEMSA because of the contract of their bottling agreement. Coca-Cola is not legally responsible for FEMSA's labor practices or any of their crimes. Basically, when Coca-Cola expands into sketchy countries, they set things up with smaller countries where they can reap all of the profits and have almost no responsibility for any wrongdoing that these bottling plants and distributors do in these countries. In the end, the only thing Coca-Cola really had to do to rectify all these things happening in Colombia was that they commissioned Cal Safety Compliance Corporation, a private firm, to inspect workplace conditions in 6 plants throughout Colombia. However, not many things came of this inspection. And in fact, there's even another documented killing which happened in January 26 of 2012 at the Barranquilla plant, where Ricardo Gomez was killed. And while conditions have mostly stabilized in Colombia and the paramilitary groups aren't as active as they used to be, there's never been any real good, true justice or progress the way that there was in Guatemala for Colombia. And that's extremely unfortunate, and Coca-Cola corporate hasn't really ever had to be held accountable the way they should have. Yes, it is a different company that just works with and franchises Coca-Cola more or less. It's still their name, it's still their brand. They still reap billions of dollars in profits from these companies. And when they know that a plant is hiring paramilitary groups to assassinate union leaders, they should be stepping in and saying, this needs to stop or we're taking away your franchise rights. Coca-Cola could have the power to make a difference and to affect these companies, but instead, every single time, they chose profits over human life. There is still currently an organization called Killer Coke. They have a website, killercoke.org, and they're still fighting to this day to make sure that Coca-Cola is responsible in Latin America and treats people down there better and takes care of the environment better and gives better working conditions. So if you want, you can check that out. As always, all my sources and whatnot are going to be linked below. But that's about all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Oh, and don't forget, drink Pepsi. Pepsi isn't even sponsored, but after this video, drink Pepsi. Indeed. Environment. No, we're not doing the thing. We're not doing it.